first-class cabin of Flight 247 hummed, with the quiet efficiency that money could buy. But even the finest leather seats and crystal glasses could not silence the piercing wails of a 6-month-old baby. Thomas Richardson shifted uncomfortably. In seat 2A, his expensive suit wrinkled from hours of travel. His wife Margaret sat beside him, her designer dress now stained with formula, and her usually perfect hair falling in tired wisps around her face. Between them, their son James cried with the relentless determination that only babies possess. Thomas had built his fortune from nothing, starting with a small construction company and growing it into a global empire. He was accustomed to solving problems with phone calls and checkbooks, but this tiny person in his arms seemed immune to all his usual solutions. The other passengers in first class cast pointed looks in their direction. A businessman in 1C sighed loudly and pulled his noise-canceling headphones tighter. A woman across the aisle tutted disapprovingly while adjusting her reading glasses. The flight attendant approached with practiced concern, offering warm milk and gentle suggestions, but nothing seemed to help. Margaret felt the weight of every stare, every whispered comment. She had been a successful attorney before James was born, confident in boardrooms and courtrooms alike. Now she felt helpless against her own child's distress, her eyes filled with tears of exhaustion and frustration. "Maybe we should have taken the private jet," Thomas murmured, bouncing James gently. But the baby's cries only grew louder. "You said it was important to travel like normal people sometimes," Margaret replied, her voice strained. "You wanted James to experience regular life." Thomas nodded, remembering his own childhood when his family could barely afford bus fare, let alone airline tickets. He had promised himself that wealth would never make him forget where he came from, but right now, he questioned that decision as James's cries echoed through the cabin. Thomas noticed movement in the economy section. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, was standing in the aisle. She had shoulder-length brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wore a modest gray sweater that had seen better days. Her face was kind but tired, as if she carried worries beyond her years. The woman looked toward first class with concern, not annoyance. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she was returning home from visiting her grandmother, who was recovering from surgery in the hospital. Sarah had spent her last savings on the plane ticket, choosing to forego meals for 2 days, rather than miss the chance to be with family. Sarah had always been drawn to children. Perhaps it was growing up as the eldest of 4 siblings, or maybe it was the summer she spent volunteering at the children's hospital. Either way, she recognized something in that baby's cry that others missed. This was not the cry of a spoiled child, but of a little one who was overwhelmed and overstimulated. She began walking toward first class, knowing that the invisible barrier between economy and first class was not just about money, but about social expectations. The flight attendant intercepted her with a polite but firm smile. "Miss, I'm sorry, but you'll need to return to your seat. I think I might be able to help with the baby," Sarah said quietly. "I have experience with fussy children." The flight attendant glanced toward Thomas and Margaret, who were now taking turns pacing the narrow aisle with James. "Sir," the attendant called to Thomas, "this passenger thinks she might be able to help." Thomas looked up, his face a mixture of desperation and skepticism. He took in Sarah's simple clothes, her worn shoes, and her earnest expression. Part of him bristled at the suggestion that this stranger could succeed where he and his wife had failed, but the bigger part of him was simply exhausted. "What kind of experience do you have?" he asked. Not unkindly. "I helped raise my 3 younger siblings," Sarah replied, "and I volunteered at a children's hospital. I've seen a lot of babies who cry like this when they're overstimulated. Sometimes they just need a different approach." Margaret studied Sarah's face and saw something that reminded her of her own younger self before law school, before the corporate world hardened her edges. There was a genuine warmth there, an authentic desire to help without expecting anything in return. "Would you mind if she tried?" Margaret asked Thomas. "We've exhausted all our options." Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Sarah approached slowly, her movements gentle and unhurried. She didn't immediately reach for James, but instead knelt beside Margaret's seat, bringing herself to the baby's eye level. "Hello, little one," she said softly. "You're having a really hard time, aren't you?" James's cries faltered slightly, as if he was listening to this new voice. Sarah began humming a gentle melody, an old lullaby her grandmother had sung to her when she was small. It was a Chinese lullaby about the moon and stars watching over sleeping children. "May I hold him?" Sarah asked. Margaret nodded gratefully, transferring the baby to Sarah's arms. Sarah cradled James against her shoulder, but instead of bouncing him as others had done, she remained perfectly still. She continued humming while gently stroking his back in slow, rhythmic circles. Her touch was confident, but tender, born from years of comforting crying. Children. Gradually, James's sobs began to subside. He hiccuped against Sarah's shoulder, his tiny fists unclenching for the first time in hours. The cabin grew quiet except for Sarah's soft humming and the steady drone of the airplane engines. "How did you do that?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with wonder. "Sometimes when babies cry like this, they're not hungry or uncomfortable," Sarah explained, still swaying gently. "They're just overwhelmed by all the new sights and sounds and sensations. The bouncing and moving around can make it worse. What they really need is to feel calm and secure." She continued to hold James, who was now breathing peacefully against her shoulder, his exhausted little body finally relaxing. The transformation in the cabin was remarkable. The tension that had gripped everyone melted away, replaced by a sense of collective relief. Margaret felt tears in her eyes, but they were different tears now. Tears of gratitude and something deeper, a recognition of genuine human kindness. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "No thanks needed," Sarah replied. "I'm just glad he's feeling better." The businessman in 1C removed his headphones and smiled. The woman across the aisle, who had been so disapproving earlier, now watched with warm appreciation. Even the flight attendant seemed moved by the scene. "What's your name?" Thomas asked. "Sarah Chen." "Well, Sarah Chen, you have a gift," Margaret said. "Have you ever thought about working with children professionally?" Sarah's smile was wistful. "I'd love to, but I'm actually headed home to help my family. Right now I work at a factory to help support my parents and siblings." Thomas and Margaret exchanged a meaningful look. James had fallen completely asleep in Sarah's arms, his breathing deep and even. She carefully transferred him back to Margaret, who marveled at how peaceful he looked. "Would you mind sitting with us for a while?" Margaret asked, "in case he wakes up again." "Oh, I couldn't impose," Sarah began, but Thomas was already speaking to the flight attendant about moving Sarah to an empty seat in first class. "It's no imposition," Thomas said. "In fact, you'd be doing us a favor." Sarah found herself in the comfortable leather seat beside Margaret, still somewhat stunned. By the turn of events, James slept soundly in his mother's arms, occasionally making the soft sighing sounds that peaceful babies make. "Tell us about your family," Margaret said, and Sarah found herself sharing stories about her siblings, her parents, who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet, and her grandmother, who had raised her while her parents worked. Thomas listened intently, remembering his own childhood, the struggles his family had faced. He saw something of his younger self in Sarah's determination to help her family succeed. "What are your dreams?" he asked. "If money weren't an issue, what would you want to do with your life?" Sarah thought for a moment. "I've always wanted to work with children, maybe become a teacher or a child psychologist. I love seeing them learn and grow, helping them when they're struggling. But college is expensive and my family needs my income now." Margaret felt a stirring in her chest, a recognition of dreams deferred. She thought of her own journey, the scholarships and student loans, the nights spent studying while working part-time jobs. "Education is an investment," she said thoughtfully, "not just in yourself, but in all the lives you'll touch." The conversation continued throughout the flight. They talked about books and dreams, about family and responsibility. Sarah shared her grandmother's wisdom about kindness being its own reward, while Thomas and Margaret found themselves remembering values they had sometimes forgotten in their climb to success. James woke once during the flight, but when he saw Sarah, he simply gazed at her with wide, curious eyes. She sang softly to him, and he drifted back to sleep without a single cry. As the plane began its descent, Thomas made a decision that would change Sarah's life. "I want to offer you something," he said, "but I don't want you to feel pressured to accept." Sarah looked at him with curiosity and slight wariness. "My company has a scholarship program for employees' children, but we also have a special fund for exceptional individuals who show promise and character." Thomas continued, "I'd like to offer you a full scholarship to study early childhood education or child psychology, whatever path calls to you." Sarah's eyes widened. "I couldn't possibly accept something like that." "Yes, you can," Margaret said firmly. "Do you know what you did up there? It wasn't just about calming our baby. You reminded everyone in that cabin about the P.